Good evening, everyone. We're so glad you're here. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are turning 50 years old this November, and we're very, very honored to be here with all of you tonight, but especially to be here with our honored guest, Mix Yaffa. Yaffa is an acclaimed disabled, autistic, trans, queer, Muslim, and indigenous Palestinian individual who has received multiple awards for their transformative work around displacement, decolonization, equity, and centering the lived experiences of individuals most impacted by injustice. Mix Yaffa is the executive director of Muslim Alliance for Sexual and Gender Diversity, as well as the founder of several nonprofits and community projects. Mix Yaffa is an engineer, death and birthing doula, peer support specialist, consultant, and artist. Mix Yaffa is a storyteller and an equity and transformation consultant, having shared their story with over 150,000 audience members at speaking events globally. We're here tonight to listen to poems and have a conversation around the new book, Desecrated Poppies. And Mix Yaffa will tell us more about how this book and this project came into being. They will also invite all of you into the conversation. I'll ask that you just wait for me to bring the microphone to you if you would like to speak. So please raise your hand. And if you're online, you may put your questions and any comments into the chat at any time. And if you would like those vocalized, just let us know and we will bring those into the room as well. I think we're gonna maybe add a couple more chairs. There's another chair up front, so we want to invite. If you would like a seat, there's also a seat in the front. We would love for you to have a seat. If you are, and there's more up here, two over here. Yeah, so let's go ahead and get everybody seated. We want everybody to be comfortable. We're so glad you're all here. We're also really glad that our friends from the Rafat Mobile Library are here. Thank you all so much for being a partner of Charis, and it means a lot to us. So we're gonna encourage folks to go check out. If you don't know what the Rafat Mobile Library is, we're gonna invite you to learn about that tonight, to go learn more and see what they are doing, and just also participate in the project. So I'm gonna invite Mix Yaffa to begin, call us into the room, and once again, thank you all so much for being here tonight.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome. How are you all doing today? Awesome. I used to, for a really long time after October 7th, I would be like, how are y'all doing? And people are like, yeah, we're okay, we're fine. I'm like, liars. And then at some point, someone reframed it where they were like, no, in here, I'm fine. Out there, no. Different answers. And so I just want to honor that and just hold that for a minute because, I've been doing so many of these events since October 7th, but I've also been a public speaker since I was 19. So for over 13 years at this point. And, obviously none of us are okay, right? And I've been doing these events in particular the last 10 months. And, for every event, there's always this sense of hope that people have of like, maybe with the next one will be okay. Right. And if not the next one, maybe the one after that. And then maybe the one after that. And we're still here, right? We're 11 months into this genocide. If we're only talking about Palestine, we're a year and a half into the genocide in Sudan. We're almost 7 years into the genocide in the Congo. We're countless years into other genocides. We're countless years into the genocide that exists here, right? And so really just want to honor that and recognize the heaviness that exists as we have these types of conversations that unfortunately doesn't necessarily go away. There is no next event where all of it is done until someday we do get to that world, right? And we get a fully liberated world. So I want to just start with really honoring that, and share just some gratitude for all of you here, gratitude for the space, such a lovely space. And this event in particular is especially exciting because I actually haven't done an event about desecrated poppies in like two-ish months, maybe a little bit longer. Which, if you've been following me along, like 2 months is a lifetime for me not to be having events. So there's been like virtual events and things like that. And I'll talk a little bit why I haven't been doing events the last couple of months. But I'm just really excited to be here, right? To be in person with people, and both in person and virtually, and just to be in this conversation with you all. So usually the way that I do this is that, I mean, we're a slightly larger group now, so we'll still do a little bit of Q&A in the end. But if something comes up for you and you're like, this absolutely needs an answer instantaneously, otherwise I will not be present anymore, raise your hand. Let's have conversations throughout, because I want to go where you all want to go versus just me sitting here and being like, here's exactly where we will end. None of this is rehearsed. If you were here earlier, you probably saw me like flipping through the pages. I was like, ooh, what did I write? And thankfully, I'm in a place within my journey where I read through my things and I'm like, wow, I'm so deep. I did great. Y'all are welcome. I'm like, okay, I want to read this for me. So thankfully, that's my reaction to it versus the opposite. But yeah, so as things come up, we will go there. And so throughout, I'll do a little bit of reading from some of the poetry, and then the difference between Desecrated Poppies and like Blood Orange, for example, is that Desecrated Poppies also has 2 essays in it, just as a way to expand in certain topics. And so I'll read a little bit from one of the essays, but they're if you're able to read through the entire essays, I definitely recommend that, because the poetry to me is really, really beautiful to bridge different realms of understanding and things like that. But to me, essays and even like short stories and things that just have a little bit more prose, they're really about abundance. They're about like, how do you really elevate, and how do you build the skill sets to be able to elevate? So it's just a little bit different in terms of knowledge gaining and acceptance than you would get with poetry, but I'll read a little bit of both. So to get things started, I'm going to read one of the first poems in this collection. And I'll talk a little bit more about like why this collection happened, when it happened, immediately after. But one thing about this collection is that there's only about 7 poems that have titles. The vast majority of poems do not have titles, and that's because you can't title a genocide. They're not named, even after the fact. So this one's on page 10, if any of you are following along, and it's untitled. It's harder to write about Palestine these days. After knowing names of family, friends, after death shrouded all we are, injustice claiming what is not theirs. Easier when the pain was fresh, still hadn't stained. Easier when it was the only purpose, every word a final hope. Harder on an endless road, 50+ tour dates, 2 books, thousands of people. Harder as the eclipse retreats, Aries calling us to war. Thank you. So you may have gotten this from that very last line. So this book was written during the week of the last eclipse in April. And that eclipse was in Aries, right? And so it comes up in a few of the poems, mostly because I was literally writing a lot of this as the eclipse was happening, right? Throughout those like couple of hours is where probably at least half this book was written. And this book was written in particular to be able to have a conversation that I was trying to have on the road in a lot of different places that I felt like we weren't necessarily having, which was a conversation around how anti-transness and anti-Palestinian politics are one and the same. And within that, it's not just about transness in Palestine. It's literally all the other forms of oppression that are intersecting with one another. They're one and the same. And so there's like poetry about things like cop cities, right? Because to me, like anti-transness, cop cities, anti-Palestinian stuff, it's not even just that they're interconnected in the sense of none of us are free until we are free, which is true, but it's literally the same people. The same people funding Cop City here are the same people funding the genocide in Palestine and in Sudan and in the Congo. And it's the same people passing all of the anti-trans bills. And my thing has been of like, I understand inter-community conflict, right? And how different communities interact with one another. And also at the same time, I'm like, I don't actually want you to like me. Right? I don't want you to care about me because I'm a trans person exclusively. I want you to care because also the same person who's coming after my transness is the same person coming after you as a disabled person. And if you don't care about me as a trans person in that moment in time, you are still getting to fascism, right? Where if we don't look at everything as fully intersectional, we're actually just detouring fascism versus preventing fascism from happening. Because it's the same people, it's the same money, it's the same everything. It's not even just the same playbook. Like often we'll talk about things as the same playbook. We hear this often of like anti-transness in like Europe, for example, and anti-transness in what's known as the US as the same playbook. No, it's the same people. Like the exact same funders, the same people behind the scenes creating all of this. It's not a matter of like someone picked up a book and they're like, ooh, I learned how to do anti-transness today. No, it's literally the same people creating the exact same campaigns, organizing across all of these places. And so Desecrated Poppies was really birthed because of that. It was like, okay, well, I need us to be having this conversation, especially at a time when, as more and more people were getting used to the genocide, because let's be honest, right? Of like, most people are very used to it at this point, right? And that usually happens between 3 to 6 months after a large scale crisis of people automatically begin viewing things as normal. And even your own personal lived experience might be a part of that, right? Maybe 6 months ago, you were thinking about the genocide every single day. And maybe now you're thinking about it every week. Or maybe you're only thinking about it as events are happening. And here's the thing with that. It's awful on one hand, but it's also natural. Our brain chemistry literally makes things normal after a certain period. Now, the way that we're able to move away from that, right, isn't by being like everyone has to be always on the exact same page. Within the world that we live in, the way to actually compensate for that is to merge with other movements that are arising in the meantime. And that doesn't always happen. And so people will normalize the genocide in Sudan. And it had been normalized by the time Palestine started. And then people will normalize the genocide in Gaza. And then all of a sudden, really big, drastic things happen to make it not normal again, potentially, or it stays normalized. But the way that we move out of that is when they kill other people, right? Other groups of people, or whatever it is that happens in the world. When those movements are able to collaborate, where they merge together, then it's always a big deal versus everything is normal. And that's a whole other conversation. And also to me, it's still incredibly relevant in like September, right? A couple months prior to the elections and everything else that we're witnessing, right? Of that, for us to truly get to a liberated world, it can't ever be just a single movement, right? Because other big things are going to happen that are going to be the thing that takes everyone's attention, and it has to bring us together. And I don't know what the next big thing is, but there will be another big thing. There's always another big thing, because within white supremacist capitalism, our bodies are always disposable, and they do dispose of our bodies and they assassinate our bodies and they weaponize our bodies against one another, right? Creating friction, creating the new normals left and right. And it just, for me, it's a matter of how do we pay attention so that we're able to really show up for those things. There's a lot happening in the world. And I wrote this book just to be able to hopefully begin some of these conversations. Where again, I'm like, if your survival is tied to mine, I don't need you to like me. Because we're going to end up in the same place either way. So we either work together or we end up in that same place. Or I will go and work with someone who actually can work with me and wants to work with me. And vice versa, of like, if you're a person who shares similar identities to me, like, for example, you could be a trans person and be fully pro-fascism, right? I don't need to work with you. You might be able to honor my pronouns and my name and a million other things, but I'm like, you still want me dead. And that's the reality in a lot of ways, right? And so I organize with people where our liberation is tied together. And for so many of us, our liberation is tied together. But it's just a matter of how are we collaborating on that? How are we working together? What does that actually look like on the ground? And within Desecrated Poppies, there's a lot of poetry and just different things that go into that. And so that's kind of the story of where Desecrated Poppies came from. So it was written during that week of the eclipse. It was published June 19th on the solstice. And that was the start of my like European tour. And so I actually did I do any events for Desecrated Poppies before I left? I probably did. I left on the 20th, and so that leaves a day, and usually every day I do events back then. And so I probably did one event or something like that, but then actually I didn't. I was supposed to, but then I didn't. Okay, yes, now I'm remembering. And I can talk a little bit about not necessarily the why, but what was happening that week that complicated certain things after I read this next poem. But then I went to Europe, had some events in different countries. And then because I randomly became a US citizen the day before I left the country, my life is wild, y'all. And so, but because of that, I was in Jordan about a month into this. And then a friend of mine was like, what if we try to go to Palestine? And I had never been allowed to go into Palestine because historically, I never had a global North passport. And if you're Palestinian, right, with a Palestinian background, even with a global North passport, chances are they're still not going to let you in. But at least you can try. And so me and this friend were like, okay, let's try. And magically, somehow they let us in. I won't go into that full story. But then I was in Palestine for the first time in my life. The first time since my parents were children. The first person from my immediate family who has like fully been displaced, other than the ones that are still in Palestine. The first person in over 60 years to step foot in Palestine, and over 76 years to step foot into Yaffa, where my dad's family are from. And so it was a lot of things. And over there, organizing is very, very different. Organizing there has to be very underground. And so obviously, while I was there, I did not have Desecrated Poppies events. I still had conversations, and that was really lovely. But that's part of why it's taken it's been a while since I've done events. So I'll read another poem and then share a little bit more about some of these things if I can find where it is. So I'm going to read a poem on page 107. So scattered within this collection, so you have the poetry that's about the anti-transness and anti-Palestinian connections and all of these other connections. But then you also have some poetry that kind of takes a step back and honors just different elements of my life and how they connect with genocide. So there's another poem that maybe I'll read later that's a conversation with my inner child. This poem in particular is really honoring, it's honoring a lot of different things from my lived experience. And so I'll read it and then I'll talk a little bit more about it, but it might seem out of place. But part of it is that genocide is not a single identity thing, right? It's not a single experience. It's connected to every single part of our lives. And when it comes to displacement, I've been displaced multiple times. I've lived in 9 countries, for example, right? But when it comes to that, your entire life is about genocide. It's all about war. It's all about the realities of oppression and what's happening to you and your people, and then other people and other indigenous people, and so on and so forth. And it's kind of interesting to try to explain, but it's like for a lot of people, October 7th was a wake-up call, right? It was the start of recognizing this. But when you're not even just displaced, but when you're displaced multiple times over, it means you never have time to really forget the experience. It never sets in as a normal thing, or the normal thing becomes the constant bringing it back up, right? Because you're moving between different borders, which means different borders will bring it up. It's not a matter of your choice. It's not a matter of just being like, I claim identity for myself, which is a beautiful thing for people to do. But it's literally like, there is no day that you get to step away from it, because the world does not let you step away from it. And that happens when you're constantly displaced again and again and again, and navigating system after system after system after system, is that they keep track of it for you. You can't forget, because if you forget, usually that ends disastrously, because it means you can no longer navigate immigration systems. Because if I go to an immigration system and I'm like, oh yeah, I kind of forgot, that doesn't work. They're not going to be like, oh, that's cute. Okay, here's a passport. Right? But you have to keep track of everything generationally, not even just your own life, to be able to navigate these systems. So I'll read this poem and then share a little bit more about it. It's on page 107, if anyone's following along. I forget what it was like driving for 18 months, freezing in my car. Cops harassing me, terrified of the day and night. I forget what it was like to sleep on park benches, men creeping and asking if I wanted a place to rest. I forget what it was like to watch war after war, new war cycles witnessed again and again. I forget what it was like to taste air as if it were filled with nutrients. I forget what it was like to sneak into houses for a packet of Maggi and steal crackers no one will miss. I forget what it was like in line for SNAP. The smell of shame lingers. I forget what it was like when the Canadian immigration officer came into the room screaming at my mom. I forget what it is like to witness another genocide, knowing we do not matter to most. I forget most things. It's a miracle I remember at all. Thank you. So I actually completely forgot that that poem was in that collection until I was flipping through it. And I was like, ooh, wow, amazing. But that poem in particular is really speaking to the reality of that. For me, none of this began October 7th. None of this ends with a ceasefire, right? None of this even ends with only a liberated Palestine. This only ends with a liberated world, period. And several months ago, as I was writing this during that week, as so many different things were kind of coming up, and so many people would look at me and be like, how do you sort of know what to do? I mean, none of us actually know how to stop a genocide instantaneously. I don't know how to do that, but I know how to be with community. I know how to show up for my people. I know how to take care of my people. I know how to do community care. I know how to organize. I know how to mobilize. I know those things. And people are like, but Yaffa, you're so young. And I was like, I became an adult living on the streets across multiple borders, one of which at war with itself. Right? And so I turned 18 between southern Syria and northern Jordan. Right? And that's some of what that poem refers to. So I've been organizing on a massive scale around these types of things from like the age of 17. And before that, I was organizing with my family because Palestinian family displaced multiple times over. Between me and my sisters, were born in 5 countries, right? So that level of displacement means that level of surviving, that level of organizing and mobilizing and community care and so on and so forth. But that's been my entire life. That's all I know. Right? If you see me in times where like there's no genocide and I'm not doing anything, you're like, Yaffa, what are you doing? Like I feel so out of place historically. I got into a much better place where I'm like, I don't need to be organizing around a genocide, right? To like survive, but that's normal for me. And as I was doing that, it was, sometimes it's easy to forget all of those experiences that happened along the way. And then people are like, but how are you here? And then you're like, oh, wait, but like, how am I here? And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, wait, no, actually, like, this is generational. Like for multiple generations, my family has been like resisting oppression in Palestine, starting with the Ottoman Empire, right? And then the British and then the Zionists, to the point of where my mom's side of the family, not my dad's, my mom's side of the family, who are from Jenin, where people finally know where Jenin is because of the invasion a couple of weeks ago. And that's been ongoing since October 7th and way before that. But my mom's side of the family, her dad lost every single immediate male relative because they were killed in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. So by the time he was 16, I think his dad was the last one. His dad was killed. And then a couple years later, he ended up leaving Palestine with my grandmother. They got married when they were 18. So I think it was like 4 or 5 years later. But so that's always been there. It's always been a part of it. But just taking a moment and really honoring those experiences. And I don't look back at those experiences and I'm like, wow, that was the worst thing that's ever existed in the history of humanity. Unfortunately, like none of my experiences are unique to me. Unfortunately, like the amount of unhoused individuals that exist in the world is ridiculous. The types of police violence that are ongoing is ridiculous. The type of labor that people have to do, the immigration systems that they have to go through. My family were refugees to Canada in, I won't say the year, it's not relevant. But literally at the time, this is probably close to 20 years before October 7th, when we entered Canada as refugees, they asked my parents if we support the state of Israel. 20 years before October 7th. That was the refugee immigration question. That was a question that determined whether or not they will let you in. This has been going on for a long time. And yet we're still here, right? And I don't say all of this to be like, let's all be devastated together, right? Like, I mean, I'm also here for us being devastated together. Devastation is a group activity, just like depression and everything else should always be a group activity. They're so much better as a group. And also at the same time, to me, though, it's not that these things devastate me. It's that these things empower me, right? When we know the realities of what's actually happening, we can actually work on fixing things. We can work to move forward. If we don't know what's happening within our own communities, there is no way to move forward. It just doesn't make sense, right? If you're generally an organizer, it's because you know what's happening in community. If you're an organizer and you do not know what's happening in the community, that is a very different conversation. Some reflection is needed there. But generally, it's when we know things that we're able to move, right? For me, it's not even about like, let's move instantaneously. It's also, we can sit in this. We can sit in this reality of like, right now, some of my family could be getting killed in this moment in time. I can sit with that. That's a reality. There's nothing that I can do right now to prevent that from happening. That is also a reality. And yet there's a million different things that I can do to still show up for people, to show up for my community in all the ways that we need one another to be showing up for, and investing in a world where the whole world is free, where the world is liberated. I can't tell you when that will happen. I don't know exactly what will make it happen. But to me, I don't care. I don't need to care to be showing up every single day. I don't get to control those things. What I get to do is come to spaces like this, have these conversations. I get to write during an eclipse. I get to be on the phone with like a million different people talking about community care and organizing across various countries. So I do want to mention something about community care. So a lot of my work is, alhamdulillah, I've had a lot of experiences, an abundance of experience. And so across every aspect of organizing and mobilizing, which I'm grateful for. And so I usually, whatever community I am in, whether it's on an international level or a very hyper-localized level, I'm always trying to fill gaps. And so if there's a lot of organizers that are doing all of the protests and the frontline organizing, right, and working on all of that, wonderful. I get to go and take care of the community care part. If everyone's doing community care, fabulous. I will go and invest in people doing the localized organizing stuff. Usually, though, the community care piece is the part of organizing that for some reason a lot of communities want to forget about. And I'm like, you cannot have direct action without community care. Like your organizing doesn't work. And it doesn't have to be the same people, right? This is why there's all of us. Oh, sorry. This is why there's all of us, right? Where there's a lot of us. There's an abundance of people. There's like almost 8 billion people in the world. We all have a role to play. Chances are a bunch of us have the exact same role to play, but we don't have to play every single role. And so the last 10 months, even though I still do some of the other aspects of organizing, most of my work has been about community care. In particular, supporting queer and trans people impacted by genocides, whether Palestine, Sudan, Congo, Kashmir, Puerto Rico, wherever in the world, I don't care. I include all indigenous people into that. I include all Black people into that, because you can't convince me that Black people and indigenous people, regardless of where they are in the world, are not impacted by genocide in this moment in time. You just can't. I mean, you can try, but like, you would probably have to buy me a lot of dinners. I don't know, but like, it doesn't make sense to me. And so that's been most of my work. And that's in line with all of my writing. So all of the profits from all of my books goes to queer and trans Palestinians in Palestine specifically. And then I have like 5 other funds that go to other groups of people. So there's the more generalized funds that support queer and trans people worldwide who are impacted by genocide. There are specific funds that support people in Sudan and the Congo. There are specific funds for frontline organizers. There's all kinds of specific funds. Abundance. We love things. Let's do all the things. And throughout all of those, I've probably been able to move between $300,000 and $400,000 over the last 10 months or so. Because I started about a month into October 7th, which sounds like a nice large number, but also the needs are so large that it's like it's a drop in a bucket. But it's still wonderful. I honor it and I appreciate it and all of the things. One thing that most people don't know is that often when we think of organizing, we think that if you go and start a fire somewhere, that puts you at the most risk of being targeted by the FBI, police officers, all that kind of stuff. That's the worst thing that you can do, right? Like do some kind of property damage because people love property, right? But the reality is it's actually community care that's the biggest risk. which most people are really shocked about, right? Because it's like, okay, but like, why is community care a bad thing? If I give you $2,000 for your rent, why? But think about it. I give you $2,000 for your rent multiple times over. Do you need your job anymore? You don't need your job. You don't need capitalism in the same way. And that is terrifying to the system, right? If all of us are no longer the labor force of capitalism, there is no capitalism. Us taking care of one another is the most anti-capitalist thing that could ever exist. Without all of these systems, there is no genocide. All of this goes away. And so us being stuck in these systems is what keeps them running. They can't operate without us. We're literally the fuel that allows it to operate. And we have to do that, right? Because we need to pay rent and we need to pay for food and we need to pay for X, Y, and Z. But then there are people like me who you can reach out to and be like, hey, I need $3,000 for rent. And I go and Venmo you $3,000 in a few hours. That's terrifying to them. And even on smaller scales of literally just giving people food. So the vast majority of states in what's known as the US actually have laws criminalizing community care. A lot of them have not actually implemented them, right? So the laws are there. They just don't necessarily enforce them, but they're starting to. And even if they're not starting to, the laws are there, which literally means that me giving you money is literally something I can go to prison for just because I gave you money. That's ridiculous, right? And this is what we talk about when we talk about moving towards fascism, right? Because in complete fascism, I can't go and give you money because I will be disappeared or I will be assassinated or I will at least be arrested instantaneously. And we've seen that in different places and in different ways. I share that not to be like the work I do is so important and also I am at such a huge risk. I've always been at risk. I was born Palestinian and I'm a trans person. And I've been an immigrant my entire life. I've been a refugee most of my life, right? Like at risk. And also though, at the same time, we need community care. Nothing in this happens without community care. We will never get to a liberated world without community care. And I want you to like look around for a second in this room or just wherever you are, right? And I want you to really think about of like, who here is your community? Like who here has your back? If you need rent next month, is there anyone here who's going to pay your rent? I want us to be moving in space where you look around and you're like, yeah, actually everyone here is going to pay my rent. I want to go to that world, right? And people are like, Yaffa, you're silly. I'm like, yes, it's true. Or if they call me crazy, then I'm like, yes, clinically, absolutely, it's true. I have the paperwork somewhere, right? But that's the world we need to be building because we can't move away from these systems without that. When we think of anti-transness and all the laws that are being passed, make them irrelevant. Make all the laws around Palestine irrelevant. They will come after us in every single way that they can. They'll try to build cop cities. They'll try to create even worse immigration policies, right? They'll try to enforce even more borders, right? They will try to cut support and resources, and they will try everything. And they've already been trying the vast majority of things. It's just that the vast majority of things are not fully impacting all of us yet. But they will. And they already impact a lot of people. And so to me, it's a matter of like, how do we still build all of that? How do we build that community care with one another so that we can move past all of this, where we can move towards that liberated world? Like I tell people to buy houses for each other all the time. And most people don't listen to me. I don't understand it. Like I'm only asking you to buy a house for somebody else. That's it. It's such a simple ask. And it's kind of funny, right? Because it's not something that happens within our communities. Like it's rare to think about, but it shouldn't be, right? Like to me, I'm like, okay, if you're in an evil tech job and you're making $300,000 a year, you can literally afford to buy a person a house every single year. at least a condo, right? Like, we don't need big houses, right? Like, it could be a small space, but you can literally afford to buy a person a house every single year. How many of y'all know people who buy people houses every single year? None of us. Right? I have a friend who does have a tech background and is in the process of literally buying a house for like local organizers, because they're like, none of y'all should have to pay rent. Let's buy a house and then people can just use it. But I want that everywhere. And it's easy to forget that reality of people buying each other's houses and making sure people's bare minimums are there is something we've lost. It's not something we're creating from scratch. When I was in Palestine, I was reading a book. I can't remember the name of the writer. Hopefully it will come back to me. But she's one of the most famous Palestinian poets, right? And she has a book that is, it's Fadwa Tuhan, who I highly recommend to everyone. If you want the spelling, follow up with me later. But so she has a book that's letters that someone compiled with like one of her friends. And so it's across these different decades and they're just corresponding over the mail, right? And so just checking in with one another and so on and so forth. And my favorite letter in that is, she's like, oh, I'm sorry I missed you. I was in Amman and like I had to so Amman, Jordan. And then by the time I got back, like you were no longer in Nablus, which is where she lives. Like literally back in the day, right before like everyone had phones and like that's how you communicated. You just sent letters to people. And anyways, and she's like, yeah, I like stayed a lot longer because I randomly got a call from someone in the UAE and I won this random award. And so they flew me out and then like I had to do a thing and then it was supposed to be $50,000, but then they doubled it all of a sudden and now it was $100,000. And then she's like, and I was just sitting there and I was like, I don't know what to do with that money. What am I supposed to do? And then she's like, but then I remembered that my sister had left an abusive relationship several years prior. And when that happened, she needed housing. So her nephew, her other sister's kid, had given that aunt his house and then wanted to build like an apartment above the house, but didn't have any more money because he just gave up his entire house. And so he went and took a loan. And so he built a little apartment above that house. And she was like, I just decided to pay that off. Right. And so like, to me, the beauty of that and the simplicity of that. And she wasn't talking about it as like, look how amazing I am. Look what I just did to my family. But it was literally this story of like how one person did something for another person and another person did something for the other person and so on and so forth. And even with her, like she starts off her first letter being like, my sister built me a small studio on her land because she knows that I don't like people. And she's like, she knows I will never talk to anyone. And so she was like, listen, you live here. You come talk to us when you want. But we're here for you and none of us are going to bother you. And she's like, they're so great. They don't bother me. I just go and see them every few months. Like they're like 10 feet away. Right. But she's like, yeah, they don't bother me. Right. But her sister did that for her. Right. And now she's doing it for a different sister's child. Right. And that's where I want us to go. Right? Where it's like one person is doing something and then another and then another. And it's this domino effect where none of us are struggling with these basic needs. Because this is how we move forward. This is how we move to liberation. It's not going to happen by all of us being entirely housing insecure, food insecure, every type of insecure. It doesn't happen that way. And yes, those types of insecurities do get people to revolt. We love revolutions. Revolutions are great. Although I'm not telling you to set anything on fire for legal reasons. I'm not allowed to say that. And so I never said that. But revolutions are beautiful. And also at the same time, if you're in a revolution with everyone in this room, if y'all do not take care of each other, there is no revolution. Because in a revolution, you need to trust that the person next to you has your back. because we're a limited resource. Yes, there's almost 8 billion humans out there, but not all of us are on the front lines, and not all of us need to be on the front lines. We get to be wherever we need to be, but we need one another. And the fact that that's being criminalized means I want to invite you to really think about how to do this in really underground ways that are not going to be criminalized. Well, they'll still be criminalized, but that you still can do it. So I mentioned that something was happening the week before I left. So interestingly enough, the day I literally picked up my passport was also the day the FBI were asking about me, which makes for a fun, like, first line of an essay that you'll read at some point. But that's the reality of doing this work, right? And I'm not out setting fires. I don't have time, right? Like, or energy or anything. I'm literally just giving people money. And yet that's who they're asking about. They're not asking about the people setting fires. They're asking about the people making this easier for others. And so how do we protect one another as we do that work? And I have some people in my life who are willing to protect me, who will go and pay lawyer fees if that happens, who will support me if I lose my job. But I've been doing this work my entire life. This is the first time in my life where that is the case. Usually I'm doing this, I'm at risk, but I know that I'm fully disposable. And a lot of you probably feel that. So how do we move towards a world where you know that people are going to pay attention when you disappear? When something happens to you, that they've got your back. And you get to really move in the world with that knowledge and that awareness. So a few things to think about, just really light things. So I do want to read a little bit from one of the essays, just a couple of paragraphs, and then we'll do a few questions in the last like 10 minutes. So I'm just going to read a few paragraphs. This essay is much longer, and it's specifically about culture work. This is just a very small snippet of it. If you're not familiar with culture work, the essay goes into that, but basically it's the world builders, right? It's the people who make the impossible possible, whether through different forms of art, through spoken art, visual art, whatever kind of thing, but it's all instilled into the community care that needs to exist within our societies. And so highly recommend it. And then highly recommend you just looking into that concept, because a lot of you are probably a part of it, but also a lot of people will stop at the art space, right? And just being creatives and creating things. But that's not what ultimately finishes like culture work. A lot of people can be artists. A lot of people use art as a way to move towards fascism. Like, let's be honest with that. And there's a whole essay that goes into that. But so there's just a few paragraphs that just give you a little bit more of my background. It's on page 74. I have always been doing community work. Belonging has been my love language since my first traumatic memory at 22 months old, and I decided to belong by dissociating. My autism has gifted me with an awareness of systems of oppression from some of my very first memories. I knew Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian hatred, ableism, and anti-poverty from about 3 years old. These systems were easy to understand in my birth country, Jordan. Then moving to what's known as Arizona, I quickly learned macro violence due to systems of oppression. I learned white supremacy at 6 when every white person I came in contact with either released dogs at me and my family in parks, followed us around in stores, or called the cops on us for existing. Fun story, the first time a person called the cops on me, I was 7. Because why not? Oppression moved from a feeling in Jordan to a direct survival threat in what's known as the United States. This is a difference that many in the global north cannot comprehend, especially in settler colonial states. Within settler colonial states, such as what's known as the US and Canada or the Zionist state, all places I hope no longer exist by the time you read this, so maybe you'll read this at a different time. It is as if you are in a meat grinder. You do not know when the grinding occurs, but you are there. In many ways, oppression in the global south is about witnessing and feeling, engaging with systems of oppression. But in many ways, the blade is not on your throat the entire time like it is in these settler colonial states. This assessment is obviously limited, for the global south is large, but it is from visiting over 40 global south countries and nearly 30 global north, and this has been my experience. At the very least, when the global south kills you as a direct form of oppression, you are free to die. If I am killed in Jordan by the state, a state that operates as a neocolony for the British, Canadians, and Americans, my family will be able to bury me with ease. They will not get into debt to return me to the soil I came from. When I am killed in what's known as the United States, I'm only buried after endless paperwork, tens of thousands in burial fees, medical bills, and taxes that I do not have. They process in life, and then when the meat is ground, they repackage us and sell us to capitalism one final time, if we're lucky. So I'll stop there because I want to give us a little bit of time for questions. The essay is longer, and so like there's a lot more to it. But I don't know, that snippet just caught my mind or my like attention earlier. And I highly recommend that essay because for a lot of people in the global north, they've never really deconditioned what the global south is, right? Especially if you haven't been in the global south, or even as a global north citizen, especially with certain privileges, if you've been to the global south, you've gotten a global north perspective of the global south, which is not the global south. That's a very different experience. And so part of the work that we have to do is fully decondition all of those things, right? I'll end with this final thing before questions of that. To me, people in what's known as the US can never be effective organizers for Palestine if they do not fully acknowledge and understand what it means to be a settler on this land, right? And it's not my place to say like what happens beyond that, although I'm totally here for more people moving to Austria. But without acknowledging that it is settlers within a settler colony who are fighting for the liberation of an indigenous people thousands of miles away, and understanding the contradiction of that, we can't move forward. It's as if like Zionists in Palestine trying to fight for indigenous Americans on Turtle Island. It doesn't make sense, right? Like you can hear, when you hear it that way, you're like, something is off here. Like your people are committing a genocide that you stand for, but you're fighting for another indigenous group of people. It's the same. And we can't move forward without fully grasping that. So I'll stop there. There's so much to talk about, but I would love a couple of questions if y'all are open to asking questions. And remember, just raise your hand, and then we do have a mic that can come around.
To get us started, we have some good online questions.
Ooh,
so why don't we break the ice that way? So Camila asks, how do you navigate when people you're working with are also under-resourced, especially capacity and money-wise? Basically the concept of queer people passing the same $5 around.
Yeah, that's so real. So this is why I believe that like the concept of mutual aid cannot truly be like fully actualized within the level of systems of oppression that we have in like what's known as the US, right? Because if we're all coming at it from a place of lack of resources, we might share things around and that might help a little bit, but eventually we have nothing left. None of us have anything left. And for me, this is where in my work, and there's a lot of answers to this question, so I'll just answer it in the way that I do my work. This is where we need to use the resources of the system itself against the system. And so like I mentioned, I have multiple funds. So it's not a single fund. So there's the fund that comes from the books. There's a separate fund that comes from selling prints and bracelets that the community has made. There's funds that come from individual donors. But then there's also funds that come from funders. There's funds that come from larger things. But so if you notice with that, there's book sales, there's print sales, there's bracelet sales, there's donors, there's funders. And that's just breaking it down to like a few groups. Because the reality is, if I just went around asking our people for money and then sending money back to our people, we run out. But instead, what I do is I get to come into a community like you all. I get to sell these books. That profit goes to queer and trans Palestinians in Gaza. And let's say we raised $1,000 here. Oftentimes, and this has never not happened, someone in the event or multiple people from the event or their connections will reach out and be like, hey, we need money for rent. And so we raised $1,000, but now I have $5,000 in requests coming in. Most people will be like, the math does not add up. But I'm like, but I will take that first $1,000. I will go and hit up a lot of richer people and be like, I need $4,000 because you're rich and you have money and my people are dying. I need more money. Or I will go to funders and I will get funders to go and pay that difference. And so all of a sudden, that $1,000 is going to Gaza for queer and trans Palestinians there. But I will get another $5,000 for queer and trans people in Atlanta. That to me is how we get to move away from that. Because otherwise, the community doesn't have $5,000 every single day. The needs of the community are so large. But when we hit up all of these different systems, we get to actually bring in wealth into the community. It doesn't resolve this, right? Like Audre Lorde told us, right? Like the master's tools will not fix this. However, the master has tools and that can pay rent and it can be a short-term thing. And for me, it's when we're in a community, right? And let's say we're all in this together. And so we're all taking care of one another and we're bringing in resources externally to support one another. To me, that is the time for our community to transform. That is the time when we each transform our lives. And so all of a sudden, if I live in a $3,000 one-bedroom apartment, which I live in Oakland, and so that is a normal price in a lot of places, how do I transform my life where that doesn't have to be the case anymore? Maybe someone's going to buy a house for organizers. Maybe we're all moving to the middle of nowhere and buying 100 acres of land for the same price, right? Like there are so many different things that we could be doing. But to me, if we sit still with the exact same needs, the exact same things, we will always run out. But if we utilize that time as a way to really community build and transform the things that we're trying to do, we can actually really move forward. And so to me, I'm like, if I can cover your rent for the next 6 months, right? What are you doing in those next 6 months? And there are people who will go and they will do so much in the world where they're like, actually, I don't have to rely on capitalism anymore. I got this. I'm going to go and organize. I'm working with youth. I'm creating things. I'm doing all of these things. And by the end of that 6 months, they're like, actually, I'm bringing in more money than you are, right? But then there's other people who I can give rent to for 6 months and they're still in the worst job that they can imagine, trying day in and day out to just survive capitalism. And this isn't blaming them. This isn't saying that we are not trying hard enough. Capitalism's hard. Surviving is really, 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 really hard. But what I'm saying is that when we shift culture together, when we open possibilities for one another, we're able to actually move forward together and move away from that place of we have nothing left for one another. So whatever that looks like for you, of what exists outside of your community, because everything is connected, right? This is why we know about all these genocides. But we can do that. We can rebuild these things, build brand new systems so that we don't have to do that anymore. One of my favorite things with all the community care that I do, because there is funds that go to therapy. There's funds that go to death work. There's funds that go to peer support. There's funds that literally go to like getting a massage. So if I send you $200 to go and get a massage, if you go and give that $200 to the Marriott spa or something, that's very different than you going and finding a community member. And now you gave that community member $200. Now that community member has $200 and that community member can go and buy $200 worth of clothing from another creator from the community. And all of a sudden the $200 is going from one person to another, to another, to another, to another. Versus the reality of the world that we live in right now, if you spend $200, you have no idea where that went. It disappears. And my people have always known that. So when I was in Palestine, if I purchased something at a refugee camp, 100% of that money went to people in the refugee camp. But again, how many of our places have that? And this is why places like this are so important, right? Because they do give money back into the community. But how do we make that for everything? Every single dollar that you're spending, how does it go back into the community? But it's once we build those things that it stops being from a place of lack, and all of a sudden none of us have anything left.
We have one more question online, and then we'd love if you are here in the room and want to ask a question, we'd love that. So Sonia says, how do we distinguish art that is self-serving from art that is truly liberatory?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's really like culture work, right? So art is always going to be moving us in different directions, right? Art can be very self-serving. And it's not necessarily self-serving is the problem, right? Because you like me doing this work, for example, right? I don't get any of the profits from any of the books that I do, right? Any of the things for donation-based stuff, like I don't benefit monetarily. Monetary, yeah, weird word. This is why capitalism needs to go. Lots of weird words, right? I don't benefit from that. And also at the same time, though, without my writing, some of you may not know me, right? And so now all of a sudden I have a larger platform because I am just doing good work, right? I am benefiting personally. And anyone who tells you that they are not benefiting in any way, shape, or form from doing any labor whatsoever, from organizing, they're lying to you. The only time that you could be not benefiting from doing organizing work is when you're a fully underground organizer. And what that means is not a single human being is going to know the work that you do, period. No one will say your name. You will not be in front of a crowd talking about these things. There's a lot that I do that no one will ever know. And that's by design. And so if you're a fully underground organizer, that might be the only time where no one's going to know anything about it and you're not going to actually benefit from it. Maybe someday after we're liberated and you come out and you're like, oh, I did this, right? But generally you're not going to benefit in the same ways. But otherwise, every art piece that you create, anything that you create, any work that you do, you are going to benefit from. And really understanding how you benefit and how you don't benefit is really, really critical. Because if you don't understand how that happens, your work will move us away from liberation. Whereas honoring it and accepting it and knowing what it means and what it does means you can move into that power to move us more into liberation. So for me, like the difference is it's actually just when you do, especially when it comes to art, when you're doing art from an understanding of what liberation is, from an understanding of what is my power, what is my privilege, what is systemically like given to me, right? What forms of marginalization am I enacting? Because all of us we're all part of the system. When I recognize all of that and I create art with all of that in mind, art will move us towards liberation. But when I pretend as if none of those things are real, art can move us away from liberation. And sometimes work that is like without any of that knowledge can still move us towards liberation. I view art as I don't view art as just an extension of the artist. I view art as its own entity. So like Desecrated Poppies exists beyond me. What you're going to get from it, you might never get from talking to me. You might get completely different things than anything I put in there. And so I could be a horrible human being and still write something really, really cute, and y'all can still move towards liberation because of it. Because to me, it's not about the artist anymore. It does matter when an artist does take up space, right? Like, for example, if I'm not impacted by any of these and I'm like, I'm going to be the lead expert on queer and trans Palestinians during this genocide, you're welcome. I am a trash person in that case. But at the same time, I could potentially create something that people will use for liberation. And I say that because we as humans, in my opinion, are always moving towards liberation. There's a yearning within us for liberation that goes beyond anything else. And a lot of people recognize that, and a lot of people fight that. And the last thing I'll say with that is that for me, it's a recognition that even in a room like this, the vast majority of people here will benefit off of oppression, and they will benefit off of liberation. And so the question for me is, how do we have conversations within our communities where it's like, okay, cool, you're making $300,000 a year. If I get shot by the police tomorrow, you're still going to benefit. But also, if my work is incredibly wonderful and moves us towards liberation, you're still going to benefit, right? Because you're still a human and all humans will benefit. But the question is, how do we actually work with one another if the person next to me is going to benefit off of my assassination? And without acknowledging that, it doesn't happen. And so for me, art is about acknowledging things. It's about how do we bring all of that to the forefront and use it as a way to change what's happening, to transform society. And again, there's an entire essay about culture work in this. But that to me is like when you take your work into more of the culture work realm, but even culture work can either move us towards liberation or it can move us towards fascism. Just think of Hollywood. A lot of art does that. I'll stop there. See if there's any final question.
So you talked a little bit about like art moving us towards liberation and things like that. And I just wanted to ask like if there's any specific language you used in the book that you could see people that you've talked to at different communities coming back around, like certain ways you talk about your transness or being Palestinian or being autistic, in specific ways and that conjure specific pictures in your head that you've seen come up in communities that you didn't expect them to gravitate to that, but you were like surprised that like it was a global experience, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. That's a great question. Yeah, I think the one thing that like throughout this whole journey, and not necessarily with Desecrated Poppies, but probably starting with Blood Orange, that I think did take me a little aback was actually the opposite. It wasn't that there was a single thing that people gravitated towards. It was that different people gravitated to completely different thing. And so with like Blood Orange, for example, which has just been out a lot longer, and so a lot more people have read it versus like Desecrated Poppies. Every like person that I would ask, like, what are your favorite poems? Or usually I didn't even ask. People just volunteer that information, right? Or we'll be like, could you read this poem? This is my favorite poem. It was never the same poems. There was never a single space where everyone was like, we actually really, really, really like the poem Blood Orange. And that's the one that we like. And one, as an artist, that is slightly validating, right? Where it's like, it's not just one thing or another. But I think that really captures the reality of that. We all have our own entry points. We all connect to things very, very differently. And so even if there's a poem where I think I'm like, you know, this is not the strongest poem in this collection or whatever, all of a sudden, literally the next day, someone's like, this is my favorite poem of all time, right? And there were some poems that people did gravitate to a little bit more, but in general, all of the poems were somebody's favorite somewhere in time. And I think that's really beautiful, right? Because I think we're all yearning to connect in different ways and to really understand all of these things. I think that's why people are here. And it also means that, let's say you pick up Desecrated Poppies, but maybe the next person needs something completely different. And this is why I think it's so important for people who are the most marginalized and with that lived experience to have so much out there, right? Because if you have my work, but then you have another trans-Palestinian's work and another trans-Palestinian's work and another trans-Palestinian's work, then if you don't connect to my writing, that's fine, because there's other offerings. Unfortunately, right now, with the reality of that we live in, I don't even know other trans-Palestinians' works to even like send you to people and places. And that's why I write a lot, right? Because I'm like, I want as many things as possible out there, and I need other people to write. And so I don't know if y'all have read Inara, but Inara is the queer and trans-Palestinian anthology that came out before this. So Inara actually came out on the day that I started writing this book. And that was like April 10th on the eclipse. But Inara is 18 queer and trans-Palestinians from around the world talking about a free Palestine. And that's short stories, essays, poetry, photos, digital art, all kinds of things. And so I want to see way more of those things in the world across every single marginalized group. because we all come into things very differently. And so you might pick this up and you're like, this is really not for me. I don't take that personally. Wonderful. Great. Gravitate towards what is for you. Find the right thing. I hope that you find it. And I hope that it does exist somewhere. And if it doesn't exist, how do we make sure our communities are developing it and making it happen? So multiple access points, whatever makes sense for people. But that's a great question. Thank you.
I think that's a lovely place to wrap up, only because I'm sure folks are going to have a little one-on-one connection with you as they get their books signed. So we do, Yaffa has prints and books available up front. The Rafat Library is here. We would love, would one of y'all actually just like to say just a word about the Rafat Library?
So the Rafat Al-Arir Mobile Library is a traveling liberation library. We were created on Emory's college campus on the day of the violent protests, and have been going from campus to campus and around all, like, the entire city, really, since with the Summer of Resistance and with Stop Cop City movement, and it has become a lovely community. And we basically have a lot of fundraising items right now, and everything goes to Gaza funds. We are also partnering with Charis, and they're hosting graciously our wish list. So if you ever want to donate to our catalog, you're welcome to. We have some on the shelf out there too. You can purchase it and bring it back to us. But we're, a growing community, and just really happy to be here.
Thank you. So we're happy that you're all here. We're very happy that Mix Yaffa is here tonight. We're very honored. So we want to encourage y'all to meet one another. The first step of doing community work is actually introducing yourself to each other. So we encourage you to do that, right? Say hi to someone that you maybe have never met before. All these people are here united around a general cause. And so you know that they're kind of already on the same page. It's a great way to meet people that you share values with. So we want to say thank you to our folks who are watching online. We really appreciate you and your questions. You can click the teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy a copy of Desecrated Poppies from Charis tonight. We're going to go ahead and say goodnight to you. We appreciate